The small bell above the restaurant door chimed as another group of well-dressed guests entered the dimly lit dining room of La Stella. Elena sighed quietly, tucking a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear as she balanced 3 plates along her arm. 6 hours into her shift, and the night was far from over. Her feet ached in the second-hand black shoes she'd polished to a shine, desperate to make them look newer than they were. "Table 7 needs more bread," her coworker Tina whispered, as they passed each other in the narrow space between tables. Elena nodded, her smile never faltering as she set down the steaming plates before 3 businessmen, who barely looked up from their phones. This was how it always went at La Stella, one of the city's most expensive Italian restaurants where the wealthy came to be seen, and the staff remained invisible unless needed. "Will there be anything else?" "Gentlemen?" she asked, her voice warm despite her exhaustion. One man glanced up briefly. "Just keep the wine coming." The restaurant hummed with quiet conversation and the gentle clinking of silverware against fine china. La Stella was housed in a converted mansion from the 1920s, with high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and separate dining rooms that had once been parlors and studies. Elena moved between them all during her shifts, serving food, clearing tables, and stealing glimpses of lives so different from her own. By 10 o'clock, her legs felt like lead. The dining room had emptied somewhat, though several tables still lingered over dessert and coffee. Elena leaned against the wall in the server's station, checking her phone. 2 messages from her landlord about the late rent. She deleted them without reading. She knew what they said. The tips tonight were decent, but not enough to cover both rent and the electric bill. "Hey, you okay for closing?" Tina asked, already untying her apron. "My kid's running a fever, and Paolo said I could head out early if someone covered." Elena nodded, though her body screamed for rest. "Go ahead. Give the little one a hug from me. You're a lifesaver." Tina squeezed her arm. "I'll cover for you next weekend, promise." After Tina left, Elena took a moment to catch her breath. Only a few tables remained, and the kitchen was winding down. She walked to the back service corridor where employees kept their belongings and splashed cold water on her face in the small bathroom. As she dried her hands, she heard it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of a piano. The melody drifted down the hallway so soft she thought she might have imagined it. Following the sound, she found herself near the rear of the restaurant, where the gardenia room, a private banquet space, sat empty most weeknights. The door was slightly ajar, golden light spilling into the dark hallway. Elena peered in, expecting to find a guest who had wandered where they shouldn't be. Instead, she saw only the grand piano that permanently occupied the corner of the room, its polished black surface gleaming under the chandeliers. She stepped inside, drawn to the instrument. The gardenia room was set up for a wedding the following day, with white-clothed tables and delicate flower arrangements. The piano sat waiting, lid propped open, a silent invitation. Elena glanced back toward the doorway. Paolo, the manager, would be furious if he caught her, but something about the empty room and the beautiful instrument pulled at her like a physical force. It had been so long since she'd played. Before she could reconsider, she slid onto the bench, her fingers hovering above the keys. The cool ivory beneath her fingertips felt like greeting an old friend. She pressed one key, then another, wincing at a wrong note but continuing, finding the melody that had been stuck in her head for days, a simple piece her grandmother had taught her when she was just a child. Elena had learned to play on an old upright piano in her grandmother's apartment, the same apartment where she'd lived after her parents died. There had been no money for proper lessons, just her grandmother's patient guidance until arthritis had gnarled her hands too badly to demonstrate. When her grandmother passed away 3 years ago, the piano had been sold to cover funeral expenses. Now her fingers remembered what her mind had started to forget. She played softly at first, then with more confidence, losing herself in the simple joy of creating music. The piece wasn't complicated, nothing like what the piano in this room usually heard during fancy events, but it flowed from some place deep inside her, carrying with it memories of warmth and safety that felt increasingly distant in her daily life. She hit a sour note and paused, corrected herself, and continued. This happened several times as she worked through the piece. Her technique was rusty, her timing imperfect, but there was something genuine in how she played, a raw emotion that had nothing to do with technical skill. Lost in the music, Elena didn't notice the door opening wider or the figure that stood watching her from the shadows. Vittorio Castellini had not planned to dine at La Stella that evening. A last-minute invitation from a potential donor to the conservatory had brought him to the restaurant, where he'd spent 2 tedious hours discussing endowments and fundraising goals. At 62, Vittorio had little patience left for such evenings, despite knowing they were necessary. His reputation preceded him wherever he went. Former child prodigy, international concert pianist, now head of piano studies at the city's prestigious music conservatory, and notorious for his exacting standards and cutting critiques. Students feared and revered him in equal measure. Many had been reduced to tears during his master classes, but those who survived his teaching went on to remarkable careers. He had been on his way to the coat check when the sound caught his attention. A halting, amateur rendition of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The wrong notes and uneven tempo made him wince, but something about the playing made him pause and follow the sound down the hallway. Standing in the doorway, he observed the young woman at the piano. She was clearly a server, still in her black uniform, her dark hair falling from what had probably been a neat bun at the start of her shift. Her playing was deeply flawed, yet there was an undeniable expressiveness in how she approached certain phrases, a natural musicality that couldn't be taught. Vittorio frowned. Raw talent without proper training was like an uncut diamond, potentially valuable but essentially worthless in its current state. He had seen it countless times, people with natural ability who never developed the discipline to truly excel. It irritated him, this waste of potential. The girl, she looked no older than 25, stumbled through a difficult passage, her frustration visible as she shook her head and started again. Vittorio's fingers twitched at his sides, instinctively wanting to demonstrate the proper technique. He had been about to step forward when another server appeared behind him. "Sir, I'm sorry, but this area is closed to guests this evening," the young man said quietly. Vittorio turned, drawing himself up to his full height. "I am quite aware," he replied coldly. "I was merely investigating the music." The server looked past him and saw Elena. His eyes widened. "I apologize for the disturbance. Elena shouldn't be in there. I'll handle this immediately." "No," Vittorio said, surprising himself. "I'm leaving anyway." "But tell me, that server, Elena, you said. Does she work here regularly?" "Yes, sir. Most evenings and weekends." Vittorio nodded, filing away this information as he followed the server back toward the main dining room. Behind them, the halting music continued, unaware of the attention it had attracted. In the gardenia room, Elena finished the piece, letting the final notes hang in the air before fading to silence. For a moment she sat perfectly still, eyes closed, savoring the feeling. Then reality crashed back. Her aching feet, the late hour, the table still waiting to be cleared. She rose quickly from the bench, straightening her uniform and hurrying back to the main restaurant. She never noticed the distinguished older man watching her from the doorway of the coat check, his expression thoughtful as he observed her rush back to her duties. Paolo waved her over as soon as she emerged. "Where were you?" "Table 12 has been waiting for their check for 10 minutes. "Sorry," Elena mumbled, hurrying to the register. As she printed the check, she noticed a distinguished-looking older man at the door, putting on an expensive coat. Something about his intense gaze made her pause. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the restaurant. He studied her with such scrutiny that she felt transparent, as if he could see every struggle, every dream she'd ever had. Then he turned and walked out into the night, leaving Elena with the strange feeling that something significant had just happened, though she couldn't possibly have known what it was or how it would change her life. She shook off the feeling and returned to work, unaware that Vittorio Castellini was already planning his return to La Stella the following evening. This time, with very specific intentions. Elena arrived at La Stella the next evening with dark circles under her eyes. She'd worked the breakfast shift at her second job, a small diner 10 blocks from her apartment, and had barely had time to go home and change before heading to the restaurant. As she tied her apron in the back room, Tina rushed in, eyes wide. "You won't believe who just requested the main dining room," she whispered, leaning close. "Vittorio Castellini." Elena shrugged, unfamiliar with the name. "Should I know who that is?" Tina looked at her like she'd grown a second head. Only one of the most famous pianists in the country. He runs the piano department at the conservatory and performs with the symphony. My sister's kid took a master class with him once and came home crying. She lowered her voice. They say he made a student so nervous during an audition that the poor guy passed out right on the piano keys. Sounds charming, Elena said, checking her appearance in the small mirror. Is he alone? No, that's the thing. He's with like 5 other people, some kind of dinner meeting with fancy music types. And get this, he specifically requested to be seated in your section. Elena paused, hairpin halfway to her bun. In my section? Why? No idea. Paolo's freaking out, though. Says everything has to be perfect. These are important people in the arts community. Tina mimicked their manager's pompous tone. A knot formed in Elena's stomach as she followed Tina out to the dining room. She didn't understand why anyone would request her section, especially someone important. Her mind raced through her tables from the night before, trying to remember if she'd served this Castellini person. The answer hit her just as she spotted him seated at the best table in the house. It was the older man who had stared at her so strangely before leaving the restaurant last night. Had he somehow overheard her playing the piano? The thought made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Paolo intercepted her before she could approach the table. Elena, these are very special guests, he hissed. Mr. Castellini specifically asked for you, though God knows why. Don't mess this up. Taking a deep breath, Elena approached the table with her most professional smile. Good evening. Welcome to La Stella. May I start you with some drinks? Vittorio Castellini looked up, his sharp eyes assessing her with unsettling intensity. Unlike the distracted businessmen she usually served, he seemed to take in every detail about her. At his table sat 2 older men and 2 women, all dressed with the understated elegance of people who didn't need to prove their wealth. Ah, Elena, Vittorio said, pronouncing her name with an Italian flourish that made it sound foreign to her ears. How delightful. Yes, we'll start with 2 bottles of the 1996 Barolo. Elena nodded and turned to leave when his voice stopped her. Tell me, do you enjoy working here at La Stella? The question was casual, but something in his tone suggested this wasn't small talk. Yes, sir. It's a lovely restaurant. And you've worked here long? She shifted uncomfortably, aware of the other guests watching this exchange with curiosity. About 2 years now. Fascinating, Vittorio said, though nothing about her answer seemed particularly interesting. And when you're not serving tables, what occupies your time? Any hobbies? The pointed question confirmed her fears. He had heard her playing. Elena's face grew hot. I keep busy, she answered vaguely. I'll get those wines for you right away. As she hurried toward the bar, she could feel his eyes following her. The wine he'd ordered cost more than she made in a week. She wondered what game he was playing. Throughout the meal, Vittorio made a point of engaging her in conversation whenever she approached the table, introducing her to his companions as if she were somehow significant. This is Dean Richards from the conservatory, he would say, or Professor Lee teaches music theory. Each time, Elena would smile politely while internally questioning his motives. The restaurant grew busier as the evening progressed. Elena moved between tables, keenly aware of Vittorio watching her whenever she was in view. By the time his party finished their main course, the dining room was nearly full, the Friday night crowd creating a steady hum of conversation and laughter. It was during this peak dinner rush that Vittorio stood up, tapping his water glass gently with his fork. The sharp, clear ring cut through the restaurant noise, drawing attention. Those nearest to him fell silent, and like a wave, the quiet spread until the entire dining room was looking his way. Paolo emerged from the kitchen, alarm visible on his face. Public speeches weren't common at La Stella. Friends and fellow diners, Vittorio began, his voice carrying effortlessly to every corner of the room. I apologize for the interruption, but I feel compelled to share something quite remarkable with you all. He gestured toward Elena, who stood frozen by the service station, a tray of desserts in her hands. You see, last night I had the unexpected pleasure of hearing this young lady play the piano. Elena felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. Every eye in the restaurant turned to look at her. It was in the gardenia room after hours, Vittorio continued, his smile not reaching his eyes. I believe she thought no one was listening, and while her playing was, shall we say, somewhat unrefined, there was something quite genuine about it, something that made me curious. Paolo shot Elena a furious look that promised later consequences. She wanted to disappear, to run from the room, but her feet seemed rooted to the floor. "So I've had a thought," Vittorio announced. "A little experiment, if you will. Lastella has that lovely piano in the corner." He pointed to the baby grand piano that sat, largely for decoration, near the entrance. "And I wonder if our talented server might favor us with a short performance." A murmur went through the crowd. Some guests looked uncomfortable, others intrigued by this unexpected dinner entertainment. I couldn't possibly," Elena stammered, finally finding her voice. "I'm working and—" "Nonsense!" Vittorio waved dismissively. "I've already spoken with the manager. He's quite amenable to the idea." Elena looked at Paolo, who gave a tight smile and small nod. His expression said everything. Refuse and you can find another job. With shaking hands, Elena set down her tray and walked toward the piano. The short distance felt like miles as conversations hushed around her. She could hear whispers, feel the weight of expectation crushing down. The piano bench was cool beneath her as she sat, staring at the keys. Her mind went blank. What could she possibly play that wouldn't humiliate her completely in front of this room full of strangers and a famous pianist? "Perhaps the Chopin you were attempting last night," Vittorio suggested, his voice carrying a challenge. He had moved to stand nearby, his dinner companions watching with expressions ranging from amusement to discomfort. Elena's fingers trembled as she placed them on the keys. She had nowhere to run, no choice but to play. She began the nocturne, the same piece she'd played in the empty banquet room, only now with dozens of people watching and listening. The first notes came out shaky and uncertain. She missed a key, winced, and continued. The piece wasn't terribly difficult. It was one of the first classical pieces her grandmother had taught her. But under these circumstances, it might as well have been a concerto. She was halfway through when Vittorio stepped forward, raising his hand to stop her. "No, no, no," he said loudly. "You're rushing the tempo and completely missing the emotional intent. The nocturne should breathe like this." Without warning, he moved beside her on the bench, nudging her to slide over, and placed his hands on the keyboard. The difference was immediate and devastating. Under his fingers, the same notes transformed into something magical. His playing was fluid, expressive, each note perfectly placed and weighted, building phrases that told a story. The room fell completely silent, people leaning forward in their seats, some closing their eyes to better absorb the music. When he finished, there was a moment of awed silence before applause broke out. Vittorio turned to Elena, his expression stern. "You see the difference? You play notes. I play music." He gestured for her to try again, now with feeling this time. Face burning with humiliation, Elena tried once more. She played more carefully now, trying to mimic what she'd just heard, but her nerves made her fingers clumsy. She stumbled over a difficult passage, and Vittorio sighed loudly, shaking his head. "Stop, stop," he interrupted. "Your left hand is too heavy, and you're pedaling as if you're driving a car through mud." Laughter rippled through the dining room. Elena felt tears threatening to spill. This wasn't just a lesson, it was a public shaming. A way for this famous man to entertain his friends at her expense. "Let me show you again," Vittorio said, demonstrating a passage with exaggerated patience, as if teaching a particularly slow child. "You must listen to what the music is saying." Each time she tried, he found something new to criticize. Her posture, her timing, her interpretation. With each correction, Elena shrank further into herself, her initial embarrassment hardening into humiliation and then anger. After what felt like an eternity, Vittorio stood up and addressed the room again. "You see, friends, this is what happens when talent goes untrained. It's like a wild vine that could bear beautiful fruit but instead grows chaotically in all directions." He turned to Elena, his voice softening just slightly. "You have a spark, young lady, but without proper instruction you're merely making noise rather than music." Elena sat frozen at the piano, unable to move or speak. The room had fallen uncomfortably silent. Some diners looked at their plates, embarrassed to witness her humiliation. Others watched with the detached interest of people observing an accident on the roadside. Just as Vittorio was about to return to his table, satisfied with his demonstration, a voice spoke from across the room, cutting through the silence with surprising authority. "That's quite enough. Vittorio." All heads turned toward the source of the interruption, Every head in the restaurant turned toward the voice that had interrupted Vittorio's performance. An elderly woman rose slowly from her seat at a corner table, leaning slightly on a polished wooden cane. She wore a simple but elegant navy dress, her silver hair swept up in a classic style that spoke of another era. Maria? Vittorio's confident demeanor faltered for the first time that evening. I had no idea you were in town. The woman, Maria, made her way toward the piano, the tapping of her cane against the hardwood floor marking each deliberate step. The room remained silent, the dinner guests watching this new development with renewed interest. I arrived yesterday, she said, her accent faintly European. I came to hear my granddaughter play with the symphony this weekend. She stopped beside Elena, who remained frozen on the piano bench, tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. But I certainly didn't expect to witness such a spectacle from you tonight, Vittorio. Elena looked up at the older woman, confused about why this stranger was coming to her defense. Something about Maria commanded respect. Her posture, despite her age, was that of someone who had spent a lifetime on stage. Vittorio recovered quickly, his smile tightening. Maria, always a pleasure. I was merely providing some guidance to this young lady. A teachable moment, if you will. A teachable moment? Maria's eyebrows rose. Is that what we're calling public humiliation these days? The restaurant had become so quiet that the clink of a fork against a plate from the kitchen echoed loudly. Paolo hovered nearby, clearly uncertain whether to intervene. Maria turned to Elena, her stern expression softening. My dear, would you allow an old woman to sit beside you for a moment? Elena nodded, sliding over on the bench. The elderly woman settled beside her, placing her cane against the piano. She looked at the keys with a familiar affection, like greeting an old friend. What's your name? She asked softly. Elena. Elena, Maria repeated with a smile. That was my mother's name. Now, Elena, may I hear you play? Just a little something. Whatever comes to mind. Elena glanced nervously at Vittorio, who stood watching them with an unreadable expression. The idea of playing anything after his scathing critique seemed impossible. I don't think I can, she whispered. Of course you can, Maria said. Forget everyone else is here. Play for yourself as you would if you were alone. Taking a deep breath, Elena placed her hands on the keys. After a moment's hesitation, she began to play. Not the Chopin Nocturne, but a simpler piece, a folk song her grandmother had taught her when she was very young. It wasn't classical or technically impressive, but it was honest. Her fingers remembered every note, finding comfort in the familiar melody. When she finished, Maria nodded approvingly. Beautiful. You have music in your soul, young lady. She turned to face the room. You know, I've spent 60 years teaching piano, and I can tell you there are two types of players in this world. Those who play the notes perfectly but say nothing, and those who may stumble but still manage to speak directly to your heart. This young woman belongs to the second group. Vittorio crossed his arms. Maria, with all due respect, there's a reason we have standards at the conservatory. Technical precision is not optional. Standards, yes. Cruelty, no. Maria's voice took on a sharper edge. Tell me, did you come here tonight specifically to ambush this young woman? To show off your superiority to your colleagues by tearing down someone with far less opportunity and training? A murmur went through the restaurant. Several diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats while others watched the confrontation with undisguised interest. At his table, Vittorio's dinner companions exchanged glances. That's absurd, Vittorio said, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. I merely wanted to demonstrate what exactly. Maria cut him off. That you, with your 40 years of training, decades of performance experience, and all the privileges that come with it, can play Chopin better than a waitress who taught herself? What a remarkable achievement, Vittorio. Your parents must be so proud. The sarcasm in her voice was unmistakable. A few people in the audience suppressed smiles. Elena glanced between the two, sensing a history she didn't understand. Vittorio's face had reddened slightly. You're making this into something it's not. I was offering constructive criticism. There was nothing constructive about it, Maria replied evenly. You forget, perhaps, that I was there the first time you played for Maestro Levinson. Do you remember what happened? Vittorio's expression darkened. That's hardly relevant, isn't it? Maria turned to address the room. You see, when Vittorio was 13, he auditioned for my late husband. He was technically skilled but stiff, nervous. He made several mistakes during his piece. And do you know what my husband did? He stopped the audition halfway through, much as Vittorio did tonight. Elena watched as Vittorio's confident posture began to crumble, his shoulders tensing visibly. Anton told this talented but terrified boy that his playing was mechanical, soulless. He made Vittorio play the piece again and again, pointing out every flaw in front of a room full of observers. By the end, Vittorio was in tears. He ran from the room and didn't touch a piano for 3 months. A heavy silence fell over the restaurant. Elena could hardly believe what she was hearing. The great Vittorio Castellini, reduced to tears just as he had nearly done to her tonight. I found him afterward, Maria continued, her voice gentler now. I told him my husband was brilliant but cruel, and that his method of teaching belonged to a different century. I told Vittorio that true greatness comes not just from technical mastery, but from having the courage to be vulnerable, to put one's heart into the music. And when he finally returned to his studies, he swore he would never become the kind of teacher who breaks a student's spirit. Vittorio stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the floor. The restaurant remained silent, the air heavy with tension. Yet here we are, Maria said quietly. History repeats itself. Vittorio finally looked up, meeting Maria's eyes. Something passed between them. A moment of recognition, perhaps even shame. You're right, he said, so softly that those farther away had to strain to hear. This was inappropriate. I apologize. He turned to Elena, his expression struggling between pride and contrition. I apologize to you as well, young lady. This was meant to be educational. I lost perspective. Elena nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The entire scene felt surreal, being publicly humiliated one moment and now receiving an apology from one of the most respected pianists in the country. Her emotions swung wildly between anger, embarrassment, and confusion. An uncomfortable silence descended until Paolo stepped forward, clapping his hands with forced cheerfulness. Well, that was certainly an exciting interlude. Now why don't we allow our guests to return to their meals? Elena, perhaps you could help in the kitchen for a bit. Grateful for the escape, Elena rose from the piano bench. As she turned to go, Maria caught her hand. You have a gift, the older woman said quietly. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Not even him. She nodded toward Vittorio, who had returned to his table, now deep in conversation with his colleagues. Thank you, Elena whispered, squeezing the woman's hand before hurrying away. In the kitchen, Elena stood with her back against the wall, trying to collect herself. The other servers and kitchen staff cast curious glances her way, having heard fragments of what happened in the dining room. Tina approached, offering a glass of water. You okay? That looked intense out there. Elena took a sip, her hand still trembling slightly. I don't even know what just happened. 1 minute I'm serving pasta, the next I'm being criticized by a famous pianist, and then saved by some elderly woman I've never met. That wasn't just some elderly woman, Tina said, lowering her voice. That was Maria Levinson. She used to be a huge deal in the classical music world, performed with orchestras all over Europe. She's practically a legend. How do you know that? Tina shrugged. My sister's kid is at the conservatory, remember? They study recordings of Maria Levinson's performances. She rarely teaches anymore, but when she does, people fight for a spot in her masterclass. Elena looked toward the dining room, trying to process this information, and she stood up for me. Why would she do that? No idea, Tina replied. But if I were you, I'd find a way to thank her before she leaves. Paolo appeared at the kitchen door, his expression stern. Elena, once you've composed yourself, table 12 needs their check and 7 is ready to order dessert. He lowered his voice. We'll discuss what happened later. For now, just do your job. Elena nodded, straightening her uniform and wiping away the last traces of tears from her face. She took a deep breath and picked up her notepad, preparing to return to the dining room where Vittorio and Maria still sat at their respective tables. As she pushed through the swinging doors, she felt dozens of eyes turn toward her, some curious, some sympathetic, others simply eager for more drama. She kept her gaze down, focusing on getting through the rest of her shift with whatever dignity she had left. What Elena didn't see was Vittorio watching her from across the room, his expression thoughtful as he observed her quiet resilience. Nor did she notice Maria scribbling something on a napkin before calling Paolo over to her table and pressing it into his hand with specific instructions. The night stretched on, the humiliating piano incident gradually fading as diners finished their meals and left. By closing time, only a handful of tables remained. Elena moved mechanically through her closing duties, exhaustion washing over her as the adrenaline of the evening finally wore off. What she didn't know was that this night, painful as it had been, would change the course of her life forever. The weekend passed in a blur for Elena. She worked her usual shifts at both jobs, moving through her duties like a sleepwalker. Customers at the diner noticed her distraction, the way her mind seemed elsewhere as she refilled coffee cups and took orders. At La Stella, whispers followed her through the dining room. The story of Friday night's piano incident had spread among the staff and regular customers. Paolo had pulled her aside at the end of that night. She'd expected to be fired. Instead, he'd handed her an envelope. "From the Levinson woman," he'd said gruffly. "She insisted I give this directly to you." Inside was a handwritten note with an address, a time, and instructions to come as you are. Elena had tucked it into her pocket, too exhausted to think about what it meant. By Monday afternoon, she stood outside a stately brownstone in the city's arts district, the note clutched in her hand. The address matched the one on the building. According to the note, she was supposed to be here at 3 o'clock. Her watch showed 5 minutes till. Elena hesitated on the sidewalk. She was wearing jeans and a faded sweater, her day-off clothes, and suddenly felt underdressed. What if this was some kind of formal music thing? She'd never been to this part of town before. The buildings here housed galleries, studios, and the kind of shops where nothing had a price tag, because if you had to ask, you couldn't afford it. Before she could change her mind, the door opened. Maria Levinson stood in the entryway, a warm smile on her face. "I saw you from the window," she said. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd come." "I almost didn't," Elena admitted. "I wasn't sure why you wanted to see me. Come in and we'll talk." Maria stepped aside, gesturing for Elena to enter. The brownstone's interior surprised Elena. Rather than the formal, stuffy space she'd expected, the home was warm and lived in. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with a mix of sheet music, novels, and framed photographs. A baby grand piano occupied the front room, surrounded by comfortable-looking furniture arranged to face it, as if the piano were a fireplace around which the household gathered. "This was my husband's home," Maria explained, leading Elena toward the kitchen at the rear of the house. "I keep it as a pied-à-terre when I'm in the city. Would you like some tea?" Elena nodded, still taking in her surroundings. Through an open door, she glimpsed what appeared to be a small music studio. Another piano, recording equipment, shelves of vinyl records. "Your husband was a musician too?" she asked, accepting the cup Maria offered. "Anton Levinson." Maria smiled at Elena's blank look. "Before your time, of course. He was a conductor and teacher, very well respected, though as you heard the other night, not always kind in his methods." They settled in the kitchen nook, sunshine streaming through lace curtains. Elena wrapped her hands around the warm teacup, waiting. There had to be a reason she'd been invited here. "I wanted to make sure you were all right after Friday night," Maria said. "Vittorio can be overwhelming." "I'm fine," Elena said automatically, the same answer she gave to everyone who asked how she was doing, regardless of the truth. Then, surprising herself, she added, "Actually, that's not true." I was humiliated. "I've never been so embarrassed in my life," Maria nodded. "It was inappropriate and cruel, but you should know that Vittorio called me the next day. He was quite affected by our encounter." "He was?" Elena couldn't imagine the imperious pianist being affected by anything. "Indeed." Maria set down her cup. "Which brings me to why I asked you here. Tell me about your background with the piano. You're clearly self-taught, but you have a natural ear and sensitivity." Elena shifted uncomfortably. "There's not much to tell. My grandmother taught me when I was little. She wasn't professional or anything, she just loved music. We had an old upright in her apartment. After she died, I didn't have a piano anymore." She looked down at her hands. "Sometimes I play at the restaurant when no one's around. It helps me remember her." "And you've never had formal lessons? No music education?" "We couldn't afford it," Elena shrugged. "I learned to read music a bit from library books, but mostly I play by ear." Maria studied her with interest. "May I ask what you do besides waitressing?" "I work at a diner in the mornings. Sometimes I pick up cleaning jobs on the weekends." Elena felt self-conscious explaining her cobbled-together employment. "The rent in this city is crazy, so I work wherever I can." "And what would you do, Elena, if you could do anything? If money and time were no object?" The question caught her off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked about her dreams that she'd almost forgotten she had any. She hesitated. I'd probably still work. I like being busy, but I'd find time to play music more. Maybe learn properly. She glanced toward the piano in the front room. I'd love to be able to play like you someday. Maria laughed gently. Oh, my dear, I'm well past my prime. These days I mostly teach when I find a student who interests me. Something in the way she said it made Elena look up sharply. Is that why I'm here? You want to teach me? I'm considering it, Maria said, watching her reaction carefully. But first, I want you to understand something important about Vittorio. Elena stiffened at the name. I'm not sure I want to understand him. Perhaps not, but you should. What happened Friday night wasn't really about you. Maria rose and walked to a side table, picking up a framed photograph. She handed it to Elena. The black and white photo showed a piano on a stage. A thin boy sat at the keyboard, his posture perfect, his face a study in concentration. Behind him stood a severe-looking man with his hand on the boy's shoulder. Vittorio, age 11, with my husband, Maria explained. Anton discovered him playing at a community center in the Italian neighborhood where his parents had immigrated. They were factory workers, no money for proper lessons. Anton heard something special in his playing and offered to teach him for free. Elena studied the photo more carefully. The boy's serious expression, the worn clothes that had clearly been carefully pressed for the occasion, the tentative position of his hands on the keys, all of it resonated with her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Vittorio was brilliant but raw, Maria continued. My husband was determined to shape him into a world-class pianist no matter the cost. The methods he used, she sighed. They were from another era, demanding perfection, pointing out every flaw, using humiliation as a teaching tool. It was how Anton himself had been taught. She took the photo back, gazing at it with a mixture of fondness and regret. It nearly broke Vittorio. As I told you Friday night after that disastrous audition, he stopped playing entirely. I found him sitting alone in the practice room one afternoon, staring at the piano but not touching it. When I asked what was wrong, he burst into tears. Said he'd never be good enough, that he should go work in the factory like his father. Elena tried to reconcile this image with the arrogant man who had humiliated her at La Stella. What happened? I started teaching him secretly, using a completely different approach. Where Anton was critical, I was encouraging. Where he demanded perfection immediately, I celebrated small improvements. Eventually, Vittorio began to flourish again. Maria set the photo down. When Anton discovered I was teaching his student behind his back, he was furious. But he couldn't argue with the results. Vittorio went on to win every competition he entered that year. Maria returned to the table, her expression serious. The tragedy is that Vittorio internalized both methods. He became a magnificent pianist, but when he began teaching, he fell back on Anton's approach rather than mine. He believes that's what made him great. The harsh criticism, the impossible standards. She shook her head sadly. What he doesn't understand is that he succeeded despite that approach, not because of it. Elena absorbed this information slowly. So when he embarrassed me at the restaurant, he was recreating his own experience, Maria finished. In his mind, he was giving you what he received, the tough love he believes shaped him into an artist. He saw himself in you, untrained talent, working-class background. That doesn't excuse what he did. No, it doesn't, Maria agreed. But sometimes understanding why people hurt us makes it easier to move forward. She reached across the table to touch Elena's hand. Which brings me back to my proposition. I'd like to offer you piano lessons. Once a week here at my home, Elena's eyes widened. I couldn't possibly afford them free of charge, Maria interrupted with a smile. Consider it my small rebellion against my late husband's teaching philosophy. I want to show Vittorio there's another way to nurture talent. Why me? You don't even know if I have any real ability. I know enough, Maria said confidently. I've been teaching for 60 years, my dear. I can recognize genuine musicality when I hear it. Your technique needs work, certainly, but that can be taught. The feeling you bring to your playing, that's innate. Elena stared down at her teacup, emotions swirling. The offer seemed too good to be true. Lessons with a renowned pianist, a chance to develop her playing properly after all these years. I work a lot, she said finally. I'm not sure when I'd have time to practice. Maria waved away the concern. We'll find a way. The brownstone has several practice rooms that sit empty most days. You could come here whenever you have free time. I don't understand why you're doing this. The older woman's eyes twinkled. Let's just say I enjoy taking rough diamonds and making them shine, especially when I suspect it might teach an old student of mine a valuable lesson in the process. Elena couldn't help but smile. So I'd be part of your plan to teach Vittorio Castellini a lesson? You'd be part of my plan to help a talented young woman discover her potential, Maria corrected. If it happens to also show Vittorio the error of his ways, well, that's just a bonus. Elena looked around the warm kitchen, then toward the piano in the front room. The idea of learning to play properly, of understanding the theory behind the music she loved, was undeniably appealing. Okay, she said finally. I'd like that very much, Maria beamed. Excellent. Shall we begin with your first lesson right now? And so, on that sunny Monday afternoon, Elena found herself sitting at Maria Levinson's piano, taking the first steps on a journey that would change everything. 3 months had passed since Elena's first lesson with Maria. Spring had given way to summer, and the city simmered under July heat. Elena hurried up the steps to the brownstone, wiping sweat from her brow before knocking. Despite the weather, she looked forward to these Tuesday afternoons more than anything else in her week. The door opened to reveal not Maria, but a young woman with a violin case slung over her shoulder. You must be Elena, the violinist said with a smile. I'm Lily, one of Maria's students. She's in the studio with someone, but she said to tell you she'll be done soon. Elena nodded her thanks and stepped into the now familiar entryway. Over the past months, she'd come to know several of Maria's select students who occasionally crossed paths in this musical sanctuary. They were all conservatory students or professional musicians, which made Elena, the waitress, something of an anomaly. She could hear voices from the studio, Maria's gentle tone and a deeper, masculine response that sounded vaguely familiar. Curious, Elena moved closer to the partially open door. You're being stubborn, Vittorio, Maria was saying. You've canceled our last 2 meetings. I'm beginning to think you're avoiding me. Elena froze. Vittorio Castellini was here? She hadn't seen him since that humiliating night at La Stella. The thought of facing him again made her stomach twist. I've been busy with end-of-term evaluations, came his reply, and preparation for the summer festival. Too busy to review the piece I asked you to consider for your program? It would mean a great deal. There was a rustle of pages, then silence. Elena knew she should move away, find somewhere else to wait, but curiosity kept her rooted to the spot. This is a student composition, Vittorio said finally, surprise evident in his voice. Yes, one of my newer students. What do you think? More silence. Elena imagined him studying the sheet music, his critical eye finding every flaw. It's unconventional. The structure breaks several classical rules, but there's something compelling in how it develops. Who wrote this? That doesn't matter right now, Maria replied. Would you consider playing it? It's brief, barely 5 minutes, but I think it would be a lovely addition to your program. You know, I rarely perform contemporary works, especially from unknown composers. Consider it a favor to an old teacher, Maria said, a smile in her voice. Now I have another student arriving soon. Will you come to dinner on Friday to discuss this further? Say 7 o'clock? Hearing movement toward the door, Elena quickly retreated to the front room, pretending to be absorbed in examining the photographs on the wall. The studio door opened fully and Vittorio emerged, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. He stopped short when he saw her. Elena, isn't it? Recognition dawned in his eyes. Mr. Castellini, she managed, her heart racing. I was just waiting for my lesson with Maria. An awkward silence stretched between them. Elena had rehearsed this moment in her mind, what she might say if she ever encountered him again. But all her imagined dignified responses evaporated under his direct gaze. Vittorio cleared his throat. I understand you've been studying with Maria these past few months. Yes. Elena lifted her chin slightly, determined not to appear intimidated despite the butterflies in her stomach. She's an excellent teacher, he said, his tone uncharacteristically hesitant. The best I've ever known. Before Elena could respond, Maria appeared in the doorway. You two have reacquainted yourselves, good. Vittorio, don't forget Friday. 7 sharp. She turned to Elena with a warm smile. Ready for your lesson, my dear? With a brief nod to them both, Vittorio departed, leaving Elena with a strange, unsettled feeling. The encounter had been anticlimactic after all the scenarios she'd imagined. No apologies. No further explanations, just awkward acknowledgement. "Don't worry about him," Maria said, leading Elena to the piano. "Now show me what you've been practicing this week." The lesson proceeded as usual, though Elena found it difficult to concentrate. Maria was a patient teacher, breaking down complex concepts into digestible pieces, never showing frustration when Elena struggled with a difficult passage. "You've made remarkable progress," Maria commented as they finished. 3 months ago, you could barely read music. Now look at you." Elena smiled, pride warming her chest. She had been practicing every spare moment, sometimes at the brownstone before her shift at La Stella, occasionally on the restaurant's piano during slow afternoons when Paolo wasn't around. The music had become her refuge, a space where the stresses of her daily life, the mounting bills, the exhausting work hours, temporarily receded. "I have a small surprise for you," Maria said, retrieving a folder from her desk. "Remember that melody you were playing around with a few weeks ago? The one you said reminded you of your grandmother?" Elena nodded. She had been experimenting with composing, picking out a simple tune that had been stuck in her head. "I took the liberty of notating it properly and developing it a bit." Maria handed her several sheets of music. "It's quite good, you know. With a bit more structure, it could be something special." Elena stared at the pages in disbelief. There was her simple melody, transformed into a proper composition with harmony, dynamics, and development. "This is beautiful," she whispered, studying the notes. "I can't believe this came from my little tune." "The foundation was all yours," Maria assured her. "I merely helped it grow." She hesitated, then added, "I hope you don't mind, but I showed it to a colleague. He was quite impressed." A suspicion formed in Elena's mind. "A colleague?" Maria's eyes twinkled. "Yes, a rather critical one at that. Now let's hear how it sounds with the changes, shall we?" Friday evening arrived, and Elena worked the dinner shift at La Stella with unusual nervousness. She kept glancing at the door, half expecting Vittorio to appear with his entourage again, but the dinner service passed uneventfully, the restaurant busy with its usual weekend crowd. It was nearly 9 o'clock when Paolo approached her. "You have a visitor," he said, nodding toward the entrance. "I've told her you'll be on break in 5 minutes." Elena looked up to see Maria standing by the hostess station, elegant as always in a deep purple dress. Her heart skipped a beat. Had something happened? 5 minutes later, Elena joined Maria at a small table in the corner. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "Everything is fine," Maria assured her. "But I wanted to invite you to something. Tomorrow evening, Vittorio is giving a special performance at the conservatory. A small recital for faculty and select students." Elena shook her head. "I appreciate the thought, but I don't think he'd want me there." "On the contrary," Maria said, sliding an envelope across the table. "He asked me to give you this." Puzzled, Elena opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note and a ticket to the recital. The note was brief. "I would be honored if you would attend tomorrow's performance. The final piece may be of particular interest to you. Vittorio Castellini." "I don't understand," Elena said, looking up at Maria. Maria smiled enigmatically. "Just come tomorrow, 7 o'clock at Hamilton Hall. Wear something nice." The conservatory's recital hall was smaller than Elena had imagined, an intimate space with perhaps 200 seats arranged in a semicircle around the stage. A magnificent grand piano stood at the center, spotlit against dark curtains. Elena felt out of place among the well-dressed crowd of musicians and faculty members. Though she had worn her one good dress, a simple blue sheath she saved for special occasions, Maria waved her over to a reserved seat in the front row. "I'm so glad you came," she whispered as the lights dimmed. Vittorio walked onto the stage to enthusiastic applause. He looked different from how Elena remembered him at the restaurant, less imperious somehow as he bowed to the audience and took his seat at the piano. Without speaking, he began to play. The first half of the program consisted of classical pieces, Bach, Beethoven, Chopin performed with technical brilliance and emotional depth that left the audience spellbound. Elena found herself leaning forward in her seat, captivated by the music and the transformation of the man playing it. On stage, focused entirely on his art, Vittorio seemed to shed the arrogance she had witnessed at La Stella. Here he was simply a vessel for the music. After a brief intermission, Vittorio returned to the stage. Instead of immediately sitting at the piano, he stepped to the microphone. "For the final piece tonight, I'm departing from my usual program," he announced. "This is a new composition, one I've only recently discovered. It's the work of a young composer who brings a fresh perspective to our art form." He paused, scanning the audience until his eyes found Elena. "Sometimes we find talent in unexpected places. Sometimes those of us who have been immersed in classical traditions for decades need to be reminded that music belongs to everyone, not just those with formal training or prestigious degrees." Elena felt her cheeks warm as Maria squeezed her hand encouragingly. "This piece is called Grandmother's Nocturne," Vittorio continued. "It's by a composer named Elena Russo." A murmur went through the audience as Vittorio took his seat at the piano. Elena sat frozen in shock as the first notes filled the hall. Her simple melody, the one she had pieced together from memories of her grandmother, now transformed into something rich and complex under Vittorio's skilled hands. Yet despite the technical flourishes and careful arrangement, the heart of the piece remained purely hers, the wistful tune that had come to her one night while closing the restaurant, a melody that carried all her memories of sitting beside her grandmother at their old piano. When the final notes faded, there was a moment of silence before the audience erupted in applause. Vittorio stood and bowed, then gestured toward Elena in the front row. "The composer," he announced as the applause grew louder. Maria nudged her. "Stand up, my dear. This is your moment." On shaky legs, Elena rose, overwhelmed by the sudden attention and recognition. Vittorio extended his hand toward her in a clear invitation to join him on stage. Before she could think, she found herself walking up the short steps to stand beside him as the applause continued. "Thank you for allowing me to play your composition," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "It's been many years since a piece of music surprised me this way. I never expected—" Elena began, but he interrupted gently. "Nor did I. It seems Maria has taught us both something valuable." He smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his stern face. "I understand you're studying with her now. Would you consider allowing me to hear your progress sometime? Perhaps provide some feedback?" He paused, a hint of humor in his eyes. "In a less public setting than our last encounter." Elena found herself smiling back, the lingering hurt of that night at La Stella beginning to heal. "I'd like that." As they turned to acknowledge the audience once more, Elena caught sight of Maria in the front row, watching them with the satisfied expression of a teacher whose most challenging lesson had finally been understood. In that moment, standing on a stage she never thought she'd reach, beside a man who had moved from tormentor to reluctant admirer, Elena felt something shift inside her, a door opening to possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The journey ahead would not be easy, balancing her studies with the reality of bills to pay and shifts to work. But for the first time, she could see a path forward that included her music. Sometimes, she realized, humiliation could be the first step toward redemption, not just for the one who had been humbled, but also for the one who had done the humbling.